So then, now I remember I saw you tell a story one time. It's on YouTube somewhere, but you're talking about a patient you were working on. You kind of alluded to this earlier, either pre-diabetic or diabetic, and you're sitting there going, you got to be kidding me, because the day before you tried to save someone's life that was, a young kid. And that was sort of was that the first time that you started thinking about nutrition as a, and earlier you talked about, hey, we do all this stuff at the end of life. It's all this prevention to prevent someone from actually dying. But if we would have invested some of that money up front, taught these people how to eat, we would have been better off. Is that sort of where it came from, or?
Not at all. I mean, I never made that connection at that time, right? So at that time, it was just what you describe. It was just the visceral reaction of, I'm so angry at you. How can you not take care of yourself? How can you be sitting here so fat, so diabetic, over and over again, you come in here to have these ulcers debrided and to have these things amputated, and you know how the story is going to go. Like, just get it together. So this was, I mean, I didn't say those words, but that's how I'm feeling, right? And so that's just part of like the callousness that developed towards that subset of patient. It wasn't until probably 2009, so I'm out of medicine now, but I was becoming overweight, and I was pre-diabetic. I wasn't diabetic, but I was pre-diabetic, and I was, that I was sort of come full circle, right? That I was like, wait a minute. I do everything right. I mean, I'm swimming 4 hours a day. I'm following that goddamn food pyramid to the core. I mean, I don't eat saturated fat. I'm like, I carb load like a banshee. Like, why is all this stuff happening to me? And so then when I, went through my whole discovery process of figuring that out, it was only then that I really thought back and reflected upon, the horrible way I had treated not just that patient in particular, but obviously many other patients like her. I remember her case specifically because it was probably like the absolute low point of my existence. So unfortunately, it took me sort of failing on my own, because at least then I could say this isn't a willpower problem. It's not like you don't care. It's not like you're not trying. You're doing what you're told to do, and you're failing miserably. So either you're an outlier or maybe the advice is incorrect.
So you're eating what you're being told to eat. You're carb loading, and you're still getting fat.
Yep.
Even though at this time you're swimming, we were just talking about it before the podcast, you're doing ultra long swims, dozens of miles worth of swimming, which, by the way, in basic SEAL training, the longest you swim is 5.5 nautical miles, which is
about
6.2 statute miles, which and that's with swim fins on. So you're out there in the open ocean swimming 12, 15, 18 miles at a time, and you're training for that, working hard, and you're quote unquote eating right because you're not eating saturated fat, and yet you're getting fat. You go into the doctor, you get blood test, and they say, oh yeah, by the way, you're pre-diabetic. And you just say to yourself, what is going on?
Yeah, and truth be told, I was actually more pissed just from the vanity standpoint at being fat. I mean, I wish I could sit
Echo
here
is nodding. For those of you on the podcast, Echo is nodding his head enthusiastically to that comment.
I mean, I wish I could say like, oh, it didn't bother me to be fat. It did bother me to be fat. It really bothered me to be fat, right? It bothered me. It bothered me a lot, actually. And so much so that I actually wanted to get a gastric bypass. And so I
How big were you?
It's like, so right now I'm about 175. I was like probably 205 to 210.
Oh, dang.
Okay, so once again, after this podcast, you and we're going to a counseling session.
I know,
you
bro.
need
That's
help.
not that big.
So I finally got my doctor to get me a referral to this guy named Ken Fujioka, who's like a very prominent bariatric physician here in San Diego. So I finally go to see Fujioka. So I'm sitting in the waiting room, and actually, I think I told this story on Tim's podcast. I don't remember telling it.
You did tell it.
But it's in the book. It's in his book.
Yeah.
I think this story is
Tools of Titans.
Yeah. So but in the spirit of assuming nobody listens to or reads multiple other things. So I'm in the waiting room. I'm finally waiting to see, and the nurse comes out, and before you go back to the clinic room, like you have to get weighed. That's just part of the protocol, right? So like they call my name. So I walk up and I get on the scale, and the nurse comes out and weighs me, and it's like, whatever, 210. And she's like, congratulations. And I'm like, what? She goes, you're post-surgery, right? And I'm like, no, I'm here to be evaluated for surgery. Yeah. She looks at me, looks out at the waiting room where everybody's 400 pounds, and doesn't say a word, but the look in her eyes is basically like, what the hell is wrong with you, kid?
You got serious issues, son.
But it seemed like a reasonable idea.
Well, yeah, very reasonable, very reasonable. You might want to check your reasonable ideas with me in the future, because that is not a reasonable idea. So you get done, you don't do that surgery, obviously. But what?
Yeah, that guy had no patience for me.
What clicked in your brain? Did you just all of a sudden say to yourself, "Okay, how is this happening?" And then you remembered your A&P class and said, "This is what's happening."
So I remember clear as day. So September 7th, 2009, I sort of did one of these long swims a year. You do a bunch of short ones, a bunch of training, but you always kind of had one main event. So my main event this year was I went back to Catalina Island, and I wanted to swim from LA out to Catalina. I had previously gone from Catalina to LA, and it was a tough swim. I had a torn labrum, so about 6 hours in, it just became unbearable pain. And you don't usually have a head current in the Catalina Channel. So the San Pedro Channel, this, you're probably trained out there. The current's usually running from Point Conception down or up. Yep. So you usually have a little bit of a cross current. Very rare to get anything back or forth. And if anything, it's generally a little bit towards the island. And when I had swum 4 years earlier from Catalina to LA, it took 10 and a half hours, but that was only 18 months after I learned how to swim. I was a much better swimmer in 2009, and I was going in the theoretically faster direction. So a great example is expectations can kill you. So I'm expecting this to be like a 9-hour swim back. And really, the only thing I'm thinking about, which is the worst thing you think about in marathon swimming, you should never, ever, ever think about how long this is going to take, because you're just setting yourself up for misery. The only real question I had is, could I break 9 hours? I should be able to break 9 hours, right? So to make a long story short, I don't even come close. This is a total disaster scenario. The other thing you'll appreciate this, just because you'll appreciate the stupidity. You never want to look anywhere when you're swimming except down. It's very demoralizing when you're in the middle. Like if you're in the middle of the channel, you don't see land from the water level. You just don't. So before you get in the water, you tell the crew, and I've crew chiefed for a lot of great swimmers. I mean, it's the crew asks the swimmer, what do you want? What information do you want? So we're starting to swim at midnight at Point Vicente. I said, okay, I want to know when there are exactly 10 miles to go and exactly 4 miles to go.
What's the total distance of the swim?
Well, as the crow flies, it's 21. And if you don't have a current, you're doing a 21-mile swim. Yeah. If you do have a current, you're going to swim more than that. So that's what I said. I said, guys, I want to know when there's 10 to go and 4 to go. Why? 10 to go, you're just a little over halfway. I'd like to just know that. At 4 to go, it's put your head down and swim for 2 hours. Don't do anything. You're there. So we start the swim at midnight. This is in September, so I forget what time the sun was rising back then. But I knew that I would have 10 to go before the sun came up. So in other words, I knew that once the light was up, I was going to be inside the 10 stretch. And one of the most amazing things about swimming in the middle of the ocean, I don't know if you got to experience this during training, is in the Pacific, the bioluminescence is awesome. So strong.
Totally, yeah.
And so on a clear night, which I was always lucky to have, every time I swam out, I've done a lot of the channel swims. Every time I've been out there, I've always been blessed with these clear nights. It's so dark, because once you get out of LA's light, under the water, so your hand is coming down, you are seeing the bioluminescence flare off your hands. When you breathe, you are seeing the stars. You can't tell the difference. It is so dark, awesome. You cannot see the difference between stars and bioluminescence. It's like being in this amazing chamber. And so that's the reward you get for swimming at night, which is otherwise incredibly lonely. And then the first thing you notice is the bioluminescence gets harder and harder to see, which means, oh, the sun's going to be up in an hour. And the sun comes up. Now the sun's like up there. I haven't heard anything. And I'm like, those guys, they forgot to tell me I've got 10 to go. That's okay. Probably down to 6 to go now. And I'm swimming. It must be like 10 o'clock in the... I mean, I'm being facetious. It's probably like 8:30 in the morning. And they're like, 10 to go. And I was like, Jesus, what? And because at that point, I had no clue what the current was like. Because a swimmer can't feel current, right? Swimmers can only feel relative velocity, not absolute velocity. So, that coupled with the torn labrum, coupled with, it ended up being over 14 hours of swimming. And this is a very long story because your question was so simple, but I remember getting on the boat.
I don't even remember what my question was.
Your question was about nutrition, about when I finally decided.
I was over here in bioluminescenceville. Okay, so this is the day.
So finish the swim,
hours.
Get back to the boat, and they've got 2 burgers and 2 Cokes waiting for me. And I mean, I couldn't have eaten those things quicker. The biggest, juiciest burgers you've ever seen, the Cokes, they tasted so good, right? Because your mouth is so salty, you actually really want something sweet. And my wife, my wife hates when I tell this story because she denies that she said it, but she completely said it. I'm just sitting there I remember this. I have a picture.
Enjoy the burger, fatty.
I've got a USA towel wrapped around my waist, inhaling I'm 2-fisting burgers, drinking my Cokes, and she just looks at me and she goes, and again, just in the sweetest way possible, she said, You should probably work on being a little less not thin.
Wow.
I mean, is that the kindest way to just tell somebody you're kind of getting a little fat?
Wow. Post 14-hour swim, open ocean, get some.
So that was the last time I had a Coke.
Yeah.
I've never had a Coke since.
Dang.
And all I did, frankly, at the time was just say, I'm just going to try an experiment. Because I was like, look, at that time I still thought it was just calories in, calories out. I thought it was really just simple arithmetic. And my view was, all right, I can't do anything more on the calories outside. There's only 168 hours in a week. I'm not willing to exercise more than 28 of them. So calories out, I don't get to change that anymore. And frankly, I didn't really want to change the calories inside because I hated being hungry. Every time I tried to eat less, I would just be so hungry I didn't know what to do with myself. So I was like, I'm going to try a new experiment. What if it's the type of calorie that might matter? Sugar strikes me as not great for you, even though I can't tell you why. I'm going to stop having sugar. So that was my first experiment in September of 2009. And that led to everything that's come since that time, which obviously ultimately led to me coming back to medicine as well.
Yeah. And that's where you're at now. And by the way, listen to Tim's podcast. What else should people listen to get all that nutritional information, the rest of the story? I think it's Tim's.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things with Tim. I did a podcast with Chris Kresser earlier this year. Talked about longevity a little bit. I probably have probably get more into nutrition on there's an IHMC video I did probably 3 or 4 years ago.
That one's an hour long, and you go pretty detailed in it?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, I've watched that one.
Yeah, probably there.
Yeah, those are good. And again, if you had to kind of tell people that aren't going to go listen to those podcasts, aren't going to watch that video, what would you tell them? What would you tell them to eat overall?
I generally don't like talking about nutrition because, and don't worry, I will answer this question, but I want to at least preface it why I don't like it. I don't like talking about this stuff. Nutrition is kind of a pseudoscience that masquerades as a religion for many people. And so I find it difficult to have a discussion about biochemistry when it's so cloaked in emotion, religion, and dogma. Now, that's not to say I don't have a strong point of view. I certainly do. It's also an evolving point of view. I feel different today than I felt 4 or 5 years ago. I feel different today than I felt 2 years ago. And also, my life is one big experiment. right? So, like we were joking before I came in here, I've got a glucose meter buried within me at the moment. I've got like all these heart rate variability things. Like everything I'm doing, actually, let me just check something. I actually did an experiment before I came here today. I ate something and I want to see how much it raised my blood sugar. That's not bad.
What did you eat?
So I ate this product that I've been doing some research on. It's called No, K-N-O-W, like No Foods. And I was introduced to this product by one of my patients who said, hey, Peter, I want you to kick the tires on this a little bit. It uses a sugar substitute called allulose, and it tastes amazing, and apparently like it doesn't raise your blood sugar at all. And I was like, yeah, I'm familiar with allulose. For those who might not know, allulose is a sugar that occurs in nature in very small quantities that looks exactly like this sugar called fructose, which is fruit sugar, the sweet component of sugar, with one small exception. But that one small exception carries with it some very important things. One, it's not quite as sweet as fructose. It's about 70% as sweet. But by giving up that little bit of that sweetness, you get a whole bunch of stuff in return. First of all, it's not metabolized by the liver, which is the real problem with fructose. Two, you barely absorb it. So 99% of it, or more or less, is excreted by the kidneys. And three, it actually seems to lower blood glucose. So this company, No Foods, is putting this, like making stuff out of this, but stuff that is like carby, like bread and waffles and muffins and stuff. So anyway, to make a long story short, I'm at this patient's house and he's force feeding me these things, which is really my way of saying he's left the bag open and I'm inhaling them. And he's like, yeah, you gotta like tell me if this stuff's legit. So to make a long story short, he plugs me into the guy who founded the company, and he has sent me a bunch of this stuff to just play with because he knows what I do, and so that's what I've been doing. So today, I normally don't eat breakfast, so I worked out this morning, and then before I came here, I had a big piece of their toast covered in almond butter, and then 2 of their huge waffles covered with almond butter and bananas. Like I made a big sandwich out of that. So the almond butter, not going to have a huge glycemic response because it's got so much fat and protein in it, but the bananas should skyrocket my blood sugar. Sure. Not to mention the 2 freaking waffles the size of my head and the piece of toast. So interestingly, so that was at 9 o'clock that I ate those. Now I've been up since 3:30, but I didn't eat anything. I worked out from 7 to 8. So admittedly, there's a bit of a glycogen debt. So at 9 o'clock, when I ingested, my blood glucose was 65. And at its peak, which was 11:18 a.m., it was up to 90. And it's now down to 83.
What would real waffles have done to you?
I think they would have sent me to like 140. 3 huge pieces of bread/waffle with the full banana. So anyway, I've been doing these experiments all week, which is just a great excuse to eat this stuff. And I'm actually surprised. I'm kind of blown away. So, okay, with all that said, what's my advice for what people should eat? In an ideal world, everybody would have this thing embedded in them like I do. This thing is called a Dexcom G5. It's a continuous glucose monitor. Typically only used by people with type 1 diabetes. We're now starting to see people with type 2 diabetes wear them, but I was really completely lucky one day sitting on an airplane next to a dude who happened to be into watches. I'm into watches. We got talking about watches. I find out he's the CEO of the company that makes this thing. The rest is history, right? I'm like obsessed with this stuff. And so, because the answer is this, right? If you were a computer program, I would say, Jocko, eat whatever you want to eat such that your average blood glucose remains below 85 milligrams per deciliter and your standard deviation below 10 milligrams per deciliter.
So translate that into English.
Okay. So eat in whatever way your genetics and epigenetics permit you to, such that your glucose levels stay low and the variability stays low. And those 2 things will ensure that your insulin levels stay low. So what I'm trying to do is optimize for something called the insulin AUC, or area under the curve. Now, we can't measure that test clinically. The only way I could measure that is put you in a hospital, put a central line in your neck, and sample your blood every 30 minutes over the course of a day where you somehow act normally. And every day, so then I'd have a time axis y-axis, the x-axis would be time, the y-axis would be insulin level, and we'd generate a curve, and we'd calculate the area under that curve, and we want that number to be as low as possible. So we can't do that outside of the research setting. So then the next best thing is keep your average glucose as low as possible and the variability. So you could have an average glucose of 100 with low variability, and that actually wouldn't produce that much insulin. Or you could have a glucose of 100 with high variability. Same average glucose, higher variability is going to have higher insulin, all things equal. So just through empirical testing in myself over the past year and a half, I've realized that an average blood glucose, and this thing tells me every time I hit click, like it gives me my last 14 days. I just realized, like, for my average to be below 85 and my standard deviation to be below 10 is like super dialed in. So what you can eat to achieve that varies tremendously by individual. There are some people who just dispose of glucose remarkably. So that blood test we're going to do in you next week is going to be our best test at measuring that. And so glucose disposal is mostly a function of the insulin sensitivity of the muscle, because the muscle is where we dispose of the majority of glucose. But it's a little more complicated than that, right? Sleep impacts that, right? So sleep deprivation makes us more insulin resistant. So this has been experimentally demonstrated, even with 2 weeks of sleep deprivation. So it's a small but very well-controlled experiment that was done out of the University of Chicago probably 6 years ago. They took a very small number of subjects, like I said, about 8 subjects, and for 2 weeks, let them only sleep 4 hours a night. And they did a very invasive test called a euglycemic insulin clamp at the beginning and at the end of the experiment. And their insulin sensitivity, their glucose disposal, deteriorated by 50%.
Oof.
And with no change in what they were eating. So it's highly variable, right? So that's theoretically the answer. On a practical level, I would say the answer is this, right? If it comes in a package, you're probably better off not eating it, right? If your ancestors couldn't have eaten this even 200 years ago, it's probably not worth eating. So if you just followed that advice, think about how many things you'd eliminate from your diet, right? If you just took packaged foods away from your diet. And again, notice I'm agnostic. You want to be a vegan? Knock yourself out. You want to be the paleo man of the century? Go for it. I don't give a shit. Okay? Like, I couldn't care less, right? But if you can largely adhere to those principles, you're kind of going to be fine. Do you want, you're going to get 70% of the way there. You want to get 80, 90, 100% of the way there? Yeah, well, then there's no simple answer. Now at that point, you got to dial in and you got to go full immersion into how do you tweak to your biochemistry? How much protein? What's the timing of the meals? When do we fast? I mean, all of the stuff that is my world and maybe soon to be your world, that's the stuff for which you cannot provide, systemic advice. But at the societal level or at just the most basic level, think about that advice. Like, you don't eat sugar anymore. You won't eat refined carbohydrates anymore. You're not going to eat, processed crappy foods anymore. What are you going to eat? You're going to eat fruits. You're going to eat vegetables. You're going to eat meat. You're going to eat grain. What kind of grains are you going to eat? Well, you're not going to really eat these sort of refined, crappy grains that people eat. You're going to, your starches. I'm sorry, not grains. Your starches are probably going to be in the form of potatoes and rice. So, again, a lot of people. I think the reason I don't like talking about nutrition anymore is I don't find it to be an intellectually honest discussion anymore. I find it to be just a discussion of dogma, right? So if you're a low carb camp, you're a low carb camp. If you're in the the vegan camp, you're in the vegan camp. Like, you can't even have a discussion about this stuff, and at least not with most people. Yeah. So I just,
You ever read the book called Diet Cults?
No.
Bro, so
does it get into this nonsense?
What you just said there, that's the whole book. Really so interesting. Fun to read too. So good.
I will have to check that out.
Diet Cults.